Hello, everyone. Welcome to this ISDP webinar. This is the fourth webinar in the series on China's Himalayan hustle that the Indo-Pacific Center of Institute for Security and Development Policy is hosting today. We are very fortunate and glad to have an eminent panel today to discuss about China's Himalayan hustle, particularly covering the issues that how India could collaborate with the Western countries, particularly the Indo-Pacific countries, who are showing a lot of interest to collaborate with India on sensitive security and defense matters. We know for a fact that China's Himalayan strategy is in news for some time now. And in fact, ISDP has taken a keen interest to follow this Chinese strategy in the Himalayan regions. We have already hosted 3 rounds of webinars. You could see those webinar details in our websites. The first webinar was more about discussing about China's infrastructural planning in the Himalayan regions. There we invited a lot of a number of European experts, Asian experts to discuss how the Chinese are trying to expand their infrastructural activities. The second webinar discussed about the China's economic dominance in the Himalayan regions. The third one, which was held yesterday, we discussed in concrete terms how the Chinese are trying to change the status quo in the regions. And I think this has been a wonderful discussion all this while in the 3 webinars. And I'm sure today, given the eminent panelists today we have with us, this is also going to be an enriching discussion. And today we will be discussing in concrete details how India could possibly collaborate with the US, with EU, with Australia, and few other countries in the Indo-Pacific, including Japan, which is a critical partner of India in the Indo-Pacific regions. To start with, just to very briefly introduce our guests to you, they are well known and their profile is there in our website. You could follow their work, you could see their writings. But just to briefly introduce you, we have from Australia, Dr. Malcolm Davies. He is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is popularly known as ASPI. Malcolm has actually spent a lot of time at the Department of Defense in the Australian government. He has worked with the naval headquarters in Australia, and he possesses a lot of experiences on defense, space, technological issues. So we are fortunate to have him, and it will be very interesting to have his perspective on PLA, on China's military modernization that China is expanding in the Himalayan and in the Tibetan regions. Then we are fortunate to also have Dr. Ernest Gunasekara Rockwell. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs. He has previously worked as acting director and managing editor of the Air University Press, and he has also worked as acting dean of the Air Force Research Institute. He has worked with the United States Army establishment very closely and possesses a lot of experiences in defense and strategic issues, particularly covering China. He holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Glad to have you, Ernest. Then we have Dr. Medha Beast. She is a faculty at the Department of International Relations at the South Asian University. South Asian University, as everybody you know, that it is an outfit of the SAARC, which is a multilateral institution belongs to the South Asian regions. Medha's research interest includes international relations, water governance, diplomacy and international transboundary issues. Then she also writes very eloquently on water issues, climate issues, on energy sectors on the Himalayan regions. I happened to work with Medha almost a decade back in Delhi in the same institute where she used to work, that is Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. Medha writes on water issues. She's an expert on water issues, and I'm glad that she is joining to this panel to contribute to this discussion how the governance issues in the Himalayan regions could be a mode of collaboration between India and the West. Then we are fortunate to also have Professor Uichiro Sato, who is a PhD from University of Hawaii, and currently he is a professor at Rishikemen Asia Pacific University in Japan. He was a visiting senior research fellow at ICS in Singapore, and he has been writing on Japan and maritime related issues quite frequently. And he's also edits one of the series in Routledge. And I am fortunate to also share some of the beautiful memories with Professor Sato in different panels. So glad to have you, Professor Sato, and I'm sure your perspective from Japan will be very useful to this discussion. Then we have another members from India today, Major General Mandeep Singh, who just retired from Indian Army a couple of years back. Currently, he is the president of Strategic Alliances Group at the Dronacharya Aerial Innovation Limited, which is a leading public company in the drone space. And he's also advisor at the Technology Business Incubation Foundation at the Indian Institute of Technology, ROPAR in India. He has been a visiting fellow at MERIX in Berlin. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Land and Warfare Studies in India, and a distinguished fellow in United Services Institute of India. He has been also dean at the Army Training Command, and I had a very good fortune to work with him again in the same institute where Medha worked, that is Manohar Parrikar Institute of Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. General Mandeep Singh has dealt very closely in the Indian Army matters relating to border affairs and China. Glad to have you, General Singh. And I think about me at the end, very briefly, I head the Stockholm Indo-Pacific Center at the ISDP in Sweden. I primarily focus on China, East Asia, and Indo-Pacific affairs. So just to start about today's webinar, and I think I'll go in the similar order that every one of you are visible in my video screen. I'll first come with Malcolm, and then I'll switch to Ernest, then Yachitiro, then I'll come to Mandeep, and then Medha at the end. So just to start with, I think we have been discussing about China's Himalayan ASIL, as I mentioned, from different point of view. But one of the key issues here that confronts all of us is that if India is willing to collaborate with the West, particularly with the US or Australia or with Japan or with EU, then can we assume that whether India will be really open to kind of collaboration bilaterally, or should we really become a little ambitious to think about a multilateral mode of cooperation? Now, in order to do that, first we need to be clear about what's going on in the Tibetan Plateau, what's going on in the Himalayan regions. So there, I think I'll come and start with Malcolm, you, that we know for a fact, and given your strong expertise on military affairs, on naval issues, I think one of the worrisome factor has been PLA's operational strategy, force modernization strategy, and also the restructuring of the PLA that has happened in 2016 and 2017. Since that time, I think many countries are facing the heat from China's military. And so also in India, India has been facing tensions on the border issues. How do you think that PLA can be managed, or what are the aspects of the PLA operational strategy, force modernization, that India and the West should take a strong note of, looking at the future, their technological hub, modernization program? How should India and the West should really take a strong note about the emerging trends, about the patterns, and what should be the medium of collaboration among us to check China's military revisionism or the Chinese revisionism that is ongoing in the Tibetan Plateau as well as in the Himalayan region? Over to you, Malcolm, for your initial remarks.
Well, thanks, Jagannath, and thank you for having me here for this interesting webinar. It's late here in Canberra, but it's sure to be an interesting discussion. Let me say straight out, I'm not an expert on Himalayan security, so I have had to do a bit of work to put this one together. But I think it's all a good learning experience. And you on the monitor behind me, you'll see some of the work that ASPI has been doing on this area, and I'll just share you the links now, so you can go to those web pages. But we've done a fair bit of analysis on what the Chinese are up to in terms of their development of military infrastructure and development of capability in the Himalaya region. I think we're all very familiar with the nature of the overall clash or confrontation between India and China in the Himalayas. So I'm not going to essentially try to go over material that we're all familiar with. But I think the key point that I would start with is that China's advantage in the Himalayas seems to be based around building infrastructure, road, rail, and logistics. They recognize that obviously the Himalayas are a highly challenging operational environment to work in. It's not like, what they're facing in regards to Taiwan or the South China Sea. This is a very harsh climate that the troops are operating in. And so therefore, they recognize that the key to having a military advantage over India is to have superior logistics, superior infrastructure. And so that's what you are seeing with Chinese developments, at least in the military sense, that they are investing in infrastructure, investing in road and rail networks to allow them to rapidly achieve mobility, tactical mobility through the operational environment compared to what would be the case if they didn't have those road and rail networks. And so let me go through some points on that. And then what I will do is go into some discussion on the force modernization aspects that I think are important. So firstly, the military infrastructure, you're seeing rapid build-up of Chinese roads, modernization of air bases to allow a full range of PLA Air Force operations in support of troops operating in the high Himalayas, rail connectivity to allow rapid mobility from internal regions of China to the Himalayas to rapidly redeploy and reinforce PLA forces there. And that mobility, I think, is really important in terms of them gaining a tactical advantage. And so, when we think about how India responds, we have to think about how can India counter that tactical mobility that China is developing. I think that the construction of roads, the network of roads and rail links is complemented by logistic support. So in other words, rather than just having forces operating in forward areas without many supplies, they're actually building supply bases, shelters to actually provide shelter for troops operating in these very harsh environment. But the supply bases and the logistic support, I think, is really critical because it means that the Chinese have that ability to sustain operations at a fairly high operational tempo and continue to provide munitions and other essential military supplies to PLA forces engaged in operations. They're also engaging in high altitude training and undertaking regular exercises in the Himalayan and Tibet region, which I think is very important because the nature of the operations there are very different from the sort of operations that PLA forces are undertaking elsewhere in China, particularly in areas close to the Taiwan Strait, which is a very different environment. So they're undertaking high altitude exercises to get troops acclimatized to that sort of harsh environment, but also to operate in a joint and combined manner. So they recognize the importance of informationization in military forces. They recognize the importance of building joint and integrated forces, even in these harsh environments. And so whilst we look at the PLA deployments in the region in terms of, light infantry, all of that is connected into long-range fires supported by not only PLA Army, but also PLA rocket forces, as well as other aspects of Chinese military power, such as PLA Air Force operations, space capabilities that can give them a situational advantage in terms of understanding what's happening in the environment. In that sense, building airfields that can operate forward deployed combat aircraft, helicopters, even tactical fixed-wing troop transports, as well as supporting operations by autonomous unmanned vehicles, I think gives them, the Chinese, sort of significant capabilities to operate and sustain combat operations through the area. Just move next page. Okay. So moving on to force modernization, I think that the Chinese recognize the importance of tactical reconnaissance strike complexes as a key element of combat operations in the area. So what you're seeing is greater investment and deployment of autonomous systems operating along the line of actual control, where these autonomous systems are the eyes and ears of the PLA forces that are linked back not only to the infantry that are operating in the area, but also further back to the long-range fires that I talked about, the short-range ballistic missiles, drones, that sort of thing. And I think the Chinese are moving from informationization of military through to intelligentization of the military, with a greater investment in artificial intelligence and very sophisticated UAVs, so that what you could see in coming years is actually a reduction in the number of ground troops that are forward deployed and a greater increase in the number of autonomous systems or robotic systems that are forward deployed, so that they can basically go in harm's way, not just in a military sense, but in an environmental sense, and have greater operational tempo, greater sustained operational pace, because they're using autonomous systems, they're using artificial intelligence directed systems to be able to generate presence, to be able to generate effect and generate uncertainty on the part of the Indians. The nature of the terrain in the Himalayas is challenging for bringing in heavy armor. You're never going to see main battle tanks and heavy armored fighting vehicles operating that area. So the Chinese are investing in light armored forces. They've developed the Type 15 light tank, which is specifically designed to be operated in that high altitude environment. But that's also complemented by special forces capabilities, including mountain warfare troops that are especially trained to operate in that area. So when you look at PLA force modernization, when you look at what they're developing, it's important to recognize that they are purposely designing their capabilities for those operational environments, but they're also utilizing the full range of PLA capabilities, including drones and long-range fires and so forth. And I think that, to me, that step towards intelligentization in war, towards smart forces utilizing AI and autonomous systems, is really going to be significant in coming years, because it could change the military balance quite significantly in that area without necessarily requiring the PLA to deploy large numbers of troops into the area. So they generate increased combat mass as a result. And I think that's important because the Chinese obviously face two very different operational environments. On the one hand, they are focused on operations in the Himalayas and along the line of actual control. But clearly, their main focus of military preparedness, military modernization, expansion is all about Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits. And of course, the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea is a completely different operational environment, completely different environment to what we're seeing in the Himalayas. So the Chinese have a challenge there in terms of how do they balance investment in two very, very different types of forces. And I think this is once again where autonomous systems, intelligentization, artificial intelligence, drones, and long-range fires, those tactical reconnaissance strike complexes, really will come to the fore. And certainly when you look at the lessons coming out of Ukraine, I think that the Chinese will be focusing very much on how the Ukrainians, for example, have utilized large numbers of low-cost drones to be able to basically be the eyes and ears and then connect back through commercial satellite networks through to long-range fires. And I think the Chinese will be thinking in terms of doing the same thing. But they do have a challenge there. If they are determined to take Taiwan, and I believe they are, probably in the second half of this decade, then how do they sustain modernization for that operation versus maintaining their presence in the Himalayas? The financial pie is only so big. They can't afford to spend unlimited amount of funds, so therefore they may have to prioritize certain types of capability investment over others. And so that's where I do think that intelligenceization really is the way forward. So, to finish up, I think that, in my opinion, we do face some serious challenges there along the line of actual control, because the PLA does have an advantage in the logistics, in the tactical mobility through building road and rail networks and modernizing air bases. They are deploying forces in significant numbers that are trained and acclimatized to operate in those areas. But that third stage of moving from informationization to intelligenceization of forces, I think, is the key. And that's going to happen in the next few years. And so India and other countries do have to be prepared for that, because if the Chinese can make that transition and gain a military tactical advantage, that might induce them to actually be more aggressive along the line of actual control and be more provocative and maybe willing to take some chances. That does raise the interesting question, is would the Chinese consider doing simultaneous operations against Taiwan on the one hand and in the Himalayas on the other? I don't believe they would, because I think the risks are too great that they would overextend themselves in both and thus not achieve their success in either. But I think what you will see is the Chinese thinking in terms of trying to use the Himalayas to distract certainly, obviously, India, but also other powers such as the United States and Australia, whilst they prepare for operations against Taiwan. I probably will finish there, but I'm happy to talk a bit more and in the subsequent discussion. So thank you very much.
I think those are really excellent points, Malcolm. Thank you very much. I think your point about the transition which is taking place in China's military forces, modernization from informationization to intelligization, which should bring together India and the West. I think that's a very well noted point, and I think we'll be coming back to you to discuss in more details about at the operational level how we could practically collaborate with each other in terms of sharing intelligence or informations at the real time of crisis. With this note, let me move to Ernest, to you. You have spent a lot of time in military establishments in the United States. How do you see China emerging as a military power in the Himalayan regions? Of course, as you see the trends which is happening for last several years, particularly 5, 7, 10 years, the problem with India is really amplifying from time to time. But what is more worrisome is that modernization and force restructuring that is taking place in Tibet. How do you really characterize all of these things moving forward, particularly when between India and US, we have 4 foundational agreements. Do you think those foundational agreement is sufficient enough to share thoughts, to support each other in the real time of crisis, or we need more? And how do you really describe the emerging trends that is taking place in the China's military modernization to force deployment to force modernizations? Maybe your thoughts. 7 minutes.
Yeah, sure. So, we got to treat this kind of in its historical context, right? So the Himalayan strategy for China goes back 70 plus years, right? With the invasion of Tibet, with the invasion of East Turkestan, and then, of course, on into, acquiring Aksai Chin and Chakchung Valley. So it's not anything new. And it's obvious that, they have then this belligerent stance as to almost a Lebensraum sort of policy in the region, where not only do they, go in and conquer, but they also then engage in Hanification of the populations and that sort of thing. So it's obviously something that we have to take very seriously. Malcolm speaks very much to the intelligentization and the autonomous systems and whatnot. It makes perfect sense for them because in my speaking with retired Indian generals and diplomats, there's no real impetus, I think, in the Indian military establishment or policy establishment to go into revanchism or irredentism themselves and go and actually, reacquire some of the territories that they've lost from China. And so it frees up China to engage in that buildup of autonomous systems and whatnot in that region, and it frees up other resources to perhaps pour into Taiwan, because there's no real concern that India is going to pour across the border and take something back that China doesn't want to lose. And in all of these probing maneuvers that the Chinese have engaged in Doklam, in Galwan Valley, and to some extent Arunachal Pradesh, there's always a lukewarm response on the part of the Indian establishment, right? It's a slap on the wrist and, hey, wag the finger and say, don't do that again. And the Chinese just kind of, yeah, okay, whatever. And so there is then this lack of concern, I think, in Beijing that the border issue with India is something that they need to be concerned about in terms of going against what they want. They can obviously build up forces and pull the trigger when they want to and make it something bigger than what it is, but they're not worried about New Delhi doing the same thing. And so that does allow them then to experiment a little bit in terms of the modernization, the climatization, and all of that in that region for Beijing. And as far as what we can do in the U.S., we've established some joint training programs, exercises. We've got the Youth Abhyas, for example. We've got Vajra Prahar, where we kind of bounce back and forth between practicing in the Himalayas and practicing up in Alaska, and I think every once in a while down in Washington State, up in the high mountains and whatnot. And so, we've got some joint exercises going on that focus on, how do we do war? How do we prepare for war in those climates? Is it enough? Probably not. What we have done in the United States to get our troops ready in a similar environment is, we've established the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies up in Alaska. And there's a lot of professional military education that's coming out of there that's geared towards preparing troops for operations in a similar climate. It would be nice to see more Indians taking part in that, and having more American troops go and study in the HAWS, the High Altitude Warfare School there in India, so that we can share lessons learned, right? It's one thing to come in for an exercise for a couple of weeks and then you're back out, but it's another thing to actually spend more time there through the PME education and through maybe longer term exchanges where we get to see how each other do things in those hostile environments. And I think that would be somewhere where we could really help out. Obviously, you brought up enhanced intelligence sharing, so it makes sense to set up a joint intelligence task force that's based on that kind of environment. And maybe that lays the groundwork for greater Indian involvement with Five Eyes in the future. That's obviously been something that both India and Japan have been interested in. It's from the Quad sense. If we look at it from that angle, it makes sense to start bringing members in a little bit more deeply into other establishments such as Five Eyes. And then we could obviously share satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and other relevant intelligence in a more timely fashion than what we do currently. We could do more exercises up there. We've got the new Joint Pacific Multinational Readiness Center in Alaska, where we could do some more training there, and not just the U.S. and India, but also, as you said, maybe we make it more multilateral. So we bring in NATO forces to engage in joint training with the Indians in that environment as well. It's not going to rattle China's cage to the same extent as if we were doing it up in the Himalayas. And all of a sudden, you've got a NATO exercise right on their border. We don't want to create the same paranoia in Xi's mind that Putin obviously got with us, getting cozy with Ukraine. So, maybe doing the training in Alaska would be a little bit less concerning for Beijing and help keep the water from boiling too much in Beijing. Obviously, there's diplomatic and economic cooperation that we could do too. we need to try to encourage U.S. businesses, for example, to engage in more investment in Indian states that border China, so that we can kind of build up then more rapport and more resources in that region. But I think that the main thing is, as Malcolm pointed out, all the modernization that's going on up there on the China side, we need to mirror it on the Indian side. And I think that that's something that, as we grow closer with India, and as our allies grow closer with India, that's something that we should really focus on, is helping them modernize. And also, there's another elephant in the room, wean them off of their relationship with Russia. That's one thing that the DoD here is always worried about is, we make all these agreements with India, and then next week Modi's over in Russia giving bear hugs to Putin. And it's like, are you a friend or are you not a friend, right? It's kind of like you seeing your girlfriend go out with another guy, right? And nobody likes that. And so, obviously part of it's, because India is dependent upon Russian weapon systems and whatnot. And so the more that we can do to, provide alternatives at a decent price and perhaps for indigenous production and everything, I think that helps then with keeping pace with the modernization that China is accomplishing up in the Himalayas on their side, frees up India to kind of be able to stand up to them in like fashion. So I'll leave it there. I've passed my 7-minute mark, so I'm happy to dive more into this later on.
Excellent. Ernest, as always, you are so frank and candid, but I think your points are well taken, that there is a possibility about Five Eyes collaborations, and I think that we must be exploring in future, whether there is a possibility to carry out this kind of collaborations where India is not a part of the Five Eyes formulations. Then satellite imagery that you pointed out could be, already it's a area of collaborations between India and the US probably, but it could be also expanded area of collaborations between India and the West. In general, exercises could be expanded. But your point about, India, Russia is well taken, but I think that's how diplomacy works. I think, many countries, those who are perceived as a adversary for other countries, they could be friends of other neighbors. So I think international politics works like that, and I think one thing is very clear, that India's relationship with Russia has not changed much between India and US. India-US partnership is still continuing to flourish and strengthening, even though there are doubts on India-Russia relationship at the strategic level. But we'll come back to you with more comments and questions during the Q&A. With this note, as we are discussing most part about the military issues, I'll invite General Singh to you to discuss about what is your perspective about the current tensions, and how do you see, what are the most 2-3 problematic aspects about China's force deployment, China's military modernization, the kind of defense expenditure, defense budgeting that is emerging from year to year, which is expanding. How do you really characterize in the context of India being watchful, India should be mindful? At the same time, what are some of these areas where India should have or possibly could have a real-time collaboration with the West? We know for a fact, and I think you and me, we have agreed about this in our institute previously, where we were working about it. When it comes to boundary dispute, probably neither China nor India would allow any third-party interference in this. And probably boundary issue is such a sensitive issue, India would also not allow West or any other third country to interfere. But there are greater issues in the Himalayan regions. There are ecological issues, there are climate issues, there are water issues, there are security issues, technological issues, where many other issues are there where India could possibly collaborate with the West. So your 7 minutes to share your thoughts. How do you really characterize some of these issues?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Panda. So there's a whole lot to talk about in the 7 minutes, but let me just first bring everybody, especially your viewers, up to speed on what's happening right now at the LAC, what's the status today, and then a lot has been spoken about the modernization by Malcolm, but I'd like to focus on what is the likely PLA strategy and what I think is going to unfold on the LSE in the days or years to come before we take on some technology developments, etc. And we'll of course talk about the contribution of external powers, etc. We'll talk later. So let me see. Right now, the standoff that is there on the LSE comes in three parts. There is a disengagement, then there is a de-escalation, and then there is a de-induction. Disengagement means breaking contact, which has happened almost everywhere except for two places on the LSE. De-escalation has not happened. De-escalation means separating the forces by a vast distance. Go back to your bases. And de-induction is when when additional forces which have been brought in move out altogether from the sector. So we are still in the first part as we speak today, and this is despite 21 rounds of conversations between the corps commanders, at least 14 meetings between the working committees, a whole lot of border and flag meetings that go on every other day. So the stance, as far as India is concerned, is pretty clear that revert back to status quo ante, and that's been spoken ad lib, and I think it's quite understood by everybody. And the External Affairs Minister has been very clear to say that it's not business as usual. So the issue about the border and the standoff on the border is paramount when we talk about any issues concerning India and China. What has always been amazing me and concerning is that what did China gain from this? Aside from raising a huge cost. You spoke about these 4 confidence-building measures. All the confidence-building measures built over 60 to 70 years by political dispositions across these years have all been thrown to the winds. They don't exist anymore. And more importantly, as we see, we have 50 to 60,000 troops facing each other. Just barely before the standoff, there were no permanent troops, at least not from PLA deployed on the LSE. They were just border troops. And today you have 50, 60,000. So it comes with a huge cost for example, creation of habitat, creation of food, stocking, equipment, deployment, ammunition. All of this doesn't survive very long on these kind of altitudes and needs to be regularly turned over. So therefore, stocking and maintaining such kind of stockpiles is very difficult. Now, all of that comes at a huge cost. And with what aim? I have always felt that the reasons why China did this has never been too clear. And I don't think much has come, no benefits or tangible gains have come China's way by this. But now, let me just move on to what ahead. So what is the PLA's, what I think is going to be the PLA strategy now that this has happened? And so you really don't have to go too far, if you see the Science of Military Strategy 2020, and if you open chapter 7, which says it's called Prevention and Handling of Military Crisis, right? It's very, very lucid and very clear. And I do believe that the Chinese follow the book to a T. If you really see that chapter, what exactly should the PLA do to handle a border crisis like the one that we are having on the LSE? And they say there are 4 issues that I'd like to flag in that. The first is pot shelving. So what they say is that keep the pot boiling, keep the issue alive, keep the opponent in a state of disequilibrium. And so this hot shelving vis-a-vis cold shelving, which is cold shelving is, when you keep something away for future generations, which is, again, some of the countries that China does. But when you see, for example, the standout that happened at Yangtze in December 2022, or you see every now and then when the Prime Minister or a President visits Arunachal Pradesh, there will be pinpricks, keeping the issue alive. protesting on the visit of the PM or the president to Arunachal Pradesh. They're for example, His Holiness went to Ladakh. There was a huge amount of protest by the Chinese government about why is he going to Ladakh, etc. So these pinpricks of keeping the issue alive, we keep seeing every now and then. The second thing that the book teaches, the playbook teaches the PLA is relevance of national laws. And very interestingly, let me quote what it says. It says when international law conflicts with national interests, insist that national interests are above all, and focus on finding the basis of military action in the relevant national laws and regulations. And I repeat, find the basis of military action in the relevant national laws and regulations. Now, that is why you're suddenly seeing this, the new border law, for example. You see, that is to legitimize this. You see the Shiogang villages, the occupation of the border villages, about 642, I think, if I remember correctly, the last, all along the LAC. All of these are to legitimize the claims of China. So that's the legal part of that, the so-called three warfare strategy. The third thing is to control the crisis. And that's very interesting. You see, it says that you isolate the extent, limit the crisis in space, don't internationalize it. Keep room for negotiations and maneuver. And if required, use coercion or blockades or ultimatums. Now, this is very interesting. So what happens is the crisis has been controlled, but there is no international involvement. So they've been successfully able to keep it away from internationalization. They don't approve of any nation commenting on this. And they're always vociferous about anybody commenting, calling this an internal affairs of China. They have kind of created issues like, for example, they have blocked access to our troops at the Daulat Beg only, at DBOC, where they've physically blocked it. Or, for example, there are shepherds that used to, herd the sheep herders. They've been blocked from going into pastures, which were earlier, they were permitted to go. So there is this thing of blocking, restricting, limiting the crisis and controlling it. And the fourth thing is, which is what concerns us the most, is seize opportunities created by the crisis. If you really go back to see what happened in 2020, it was the COVID time. One really would say that at that stage, if you see, China was on the firing line, everybody was blaming China for that. World economy was, the world opinion was against China, and then it was all about party reputation. So if you see at that time, they have actually seen an opportunity in the crisis. And even now, as we see the standoff, it doesn't rule out, the teaching says that if there's an opportunity, go for it. So we cannot let our guard down, because you just don't know when they're going to, exploit the situation. So if you were to ask me what is going to be the future of the LAC in the next few, maybe years or days, I would say that it's going to be a hot LAC, legally supported by national laws, unlikely to expand in scope, keeping communications and negotiations open, and yet exploiting fleeting opportunities to increase bargaining power. So that is, in some, I feel, is the kind of strategy. Now, insofar as technical developments, a lot of the infrastructure and modernization has been covered by Malcolm. Yes, please.
Yeah.
You said something?
No. Please go ahead. You have just 2 minutes.
Yeah. And so a lot of what the new technologies that China boasts of, the PLA boasts of, is visible, and we'll be seeing it around on the LSC, for example, real-time satellite intelligence, space-based intelligence, stealth aircraft. We've seen the J-20s coming into Kashgar. We've seen the deployment of SRBMs coming in from the east to the west, particularly the raising of a Dongfeng 2-6 MRBM brigade opposite our areas. We've seen top-line tanks. We've seen their top-line T-92A2, which is a heavy tank that came in, along with their new light tanks, which is the ZTX-15. We've seen a a very sophisticated, layered kind of an air defense system now, which is vertical and in depth. A lot of EW measures have been taken, and we know, for example, a whole lot of ECM and ECCM, ECM and ESM resources deployed, and large numbers of drones. I mean, there are a whole lot of drones flying all over the LSC. We see them pretty frequently. But that's not all. It's also happening down below. We are also seeing activity in the maritime space, where we're seeing submarines popping up left, right in the Indian Ocean very frequently. And more recently, the presence of research ships, ostensibly to map survey, but they also come to monitor some of our weapon systems. So I'll stop here just to bring you a little bit about the technology and the strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are excellent points. Again, as usual, I think your point about hot LAC is well taken. I think I do agree with you that going forward, probably everything will be legalized from national point of view. And I think both China and India are working on that. And also some of the Himalayan smaller countries in the regions are working towards that. So I do agree with you. I'll have some follow-up comments comments on some of these issues. But let me quickly go to Sato-san. Who is, listening to all the military perspective. And I think Sato-san, being a civilian, academicians and coming from Japan, he will have some strong views to share probably. So Sato-san, you have covered about, Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy. How do you really see the China's military modernization and built up in the Himalayan regions? Do you really correlate any of these China's military planning in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, in the Senkaku Island with the Himalayan regions or in the Tibetan regions? What are the common elements you do see? And what are the issues that should bring together both India and Japan, as well as India and the West, or India and the Indo-Pacific partner? Maybe you could share some of your thoughts. Over to you for 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. It's actually very interesting to hear about the military perspectives of the borderland disputes and a lot of tactical implications. Yes, as Jagannath expected, I approached the issues from a slightly different, more diplomatic angles. Largely because I do not currently see any direct tactical involvement of Japan in India's territorial dispute with China in the borderland regions. And I think, as Jagannath earlier said, nobody, neither India nor China, want a third party to get involved in their border disputes, and neither Japan wish to get itself involved in the border dispute between China and India. Politically, Japan has maintained neutrality on the Sino-Indian border territorial issues. So, having said that, what is the role of Japan in the Himalayan region? I would argue that despite this neutrality and reluctance to get itself involved in the border dispute issues, Japan is moving a step closer to supporting India's actual line of control, but in the least direct way. And I think earlier, the issue of infrastructure for connectivity was emphasized. And for India, the northeastern part of its territory has suffered from the lack of development and largely due to the lack of connectivity with the growing center of the country. So for India, improving connectivity of this northeastern region with both the central part of India, major cities, as well as with the neighboring countries, most importantly, the Bangladesh, and if it becomes more reasonable to expect also with Myanmar as well. Of course, currently the connectivity with Myanmar is very problematic because of the instability in Myanmar. But also I would also add that the connectivity into Bhutan is important as China's influence in Bhutan is growing, and for India, that's not something India would just, pretend not to see. So the connectivity between India and Bhutan is important for India, and Japan is willing to aid India in such a domain. So I would like to make this point by just looking at some of the recent Japanese approved aid project. And of course, the northeastern part of India, especially the mountain region, is important for the water resource. And the Brahmaputra originates in many tributary rivers in northeast and bordering China. And Japan's aid has previously focused on industrializing urban centers, not in northeastern India. But for the last 2 years, Japan started approving a couple of projects, and I'd like to specifically refer to 2 of those. And sorry, I have it in Japanese. I didn't have a chance to translate it, but it's easier to see it on the map on the next page. In 2002, March, Japan and India agreed to the yen-based loans for the phase 6 of northeastern states road connection improvement, and for the amount of 23 billion and 129 million yen. I forgot the conversion between dollar and yen because whenever I think about it, it makes me cry these days. So, but anyway, this project would connect improve the connectivity of the Highway 208, and this connects the northeastern part of India, and you can see how 208 is running from south to north of the northeastern part of India. So the connectivity this area is to be improved, and that was in 2022. And 2 years later, another project in the northeastern part of India has been approved, and that's the phase 3 of the road improvement project for 34 billion and 537 million yen. And This will connect the Dupli in Assam state and Purubari of the Meghalaya state, and a bridge will be built for the length of some 20 kilometers across the Brahmaputra River to actually connect the northern part and the southern part of the highway 127B, and this will supposedly improve the connectivity within this region as well as with the neighboring areas. And connected to that, on the same highway 127B, from Purubari to Goiragri, the road is to be improved, and you can see some of those places. The bridge will be constructed between those two places, Dubli and Purubari, and then the road improvement is to be extended to Goiragri in the indicated by a red arrow here. So this is new for Japan, that Japan is doing something in the least developed part of India, where the transplants for Japanese manufacturing corporations are pretty much irrelevant at the moment. The previous aid was to support Japan's the manufacturing transplant in India by improving road and port infrastructures and electricity supply and so forth. But this new connectivity initiatives in northeastern India has the Indian economic connectivity and Indian kind of dual use for security purposes as the primary objectives rather than Japanese corporations' interests. So how significant it is? Well, just by looking at the amount, it's not that big yet. But given the limited budget resources and other competing priorities of Japanese aid elsewhere, I think this first step is something to keep eyes on. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sato-san. I think those were very relevant points, what you mentioned. I think even though Japan is not really directly involved or not willing to involve militarily in the Himalayan regions, but given the kind of investment it's doing, the kind of soft power image it carries in the regions, it has relevant interest. And I think that should not be ignored. And we will come back to you to discuss further about what India, Japan, and possibly any third countries in the regions could possibly do. Any trilateral, minilateral, or multilateral collaborations possibly we could do. We will come back to you in the next round. But your points about water and about those maps here is very interesting, and this encouraged me to bring Medha into the discussion, who is very patiently hearing. And given your background, Medha, about ecology, about water, and about water management issues, you have been writing a lot about some of these issues. I would pose a couple of questions to you by saying that what are the problematic issues you see in China's approach when it comes to the governance issues in the Himalayan regions, particularly water issues, ecology, climate issues, forest issues? How do you see China is really affecting the regions by acting as a dominant power? That is number one. Number two, what India and the other Himalayan countries, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, should really note and worry about China's, China's strategy of, affecting those ecological issues in the Himalayan regions. How should the world or the Himalayan world should address some of these issues? Over to you for 7-8 minutes.
Thank you, Jagannath, and I hope I'm audible. I am? Okay, great. So, I think I'll take the second one up first. And it's very important, and I do that because it's very important to understand the context, and the landscape within which we actually find China's Himalayan strategy. And to my mind, when I really look as an analyst there, I see two broad patterns emerging. One is primarily the Chinese strategic design, and the second is India's response to this strategic design. And I would say that both these strategic frameworks, have a very significant geopolitical and a geoeconomic component attached with them, which, to my mind, are really manifesting in a very unique balancing act. And this balancing act, I would say, is externally directed as well as internally driven. So to give this a perspective in terms of what others have also spoken about, if you really look at the internal balancing of China, what we really see is the military buildup, which is happening in terms of the force structures, the air bases, the heliports and the air defense structures and the sites which are coming up. In terms of internal balancing, again, one is really seeing these large-scale civilian infrastructure settlements which are coming up in Tibetan borders, where one is really seeing a fusion of both civilian and military policies. And thirdly, what is also sort of significant when one really looks at this pattern of internal balancing is this idea of recruitment drive, which is happening in the Tibetan border villages, which I think is significant. Now, as far as China's internal balancing practices are concerned, and this is here, I think, before we really go on to analyzing how the Himalayan states are looking at, but it's important to understand, how China is really trying to balance India vis-a-vis China's Himalayan strategy. And one can really see its engagement with the South Asian neighbors, particularly Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. We know in the last 2 decades or so, Bhutan-China negotiations have actually moved forward to a considerable degree to what they were in the early 2000s. The pattern now is very different. Similarly, in the case of Bangladesh, we really see China is one of the most primary investment partners, particularly in the economic sector, power sector, connectivity, and the renewables particularly. And in Nepal, where I see that China is not really doing so much vis-a-vis its BRI strategy, but at the same time, they really do have their strategic convergences at place. And I think the issue really came up in 2020 around the Mahakali Kalapani dispute. So this was about China's external balancing. And once one really moves on to the Indian part, one really sees that India has been doing the same thing internally. India is coming up with this Arunachal, it's called, I think, the Arunachal Pradesh Highway Frontier, which will be completed in 2027. There is an economic east-west connectivity corridor, which is coming up. There is a vibrant village program, again, which is coming up. And India, for one, as the previous speakers also spoke about, India is also rebalancing its force structures, where a lot of focus on mountainous strike formations, particularly even in collaboration with the US, is going on. Now, interestingly, when we really see the Indian Balancing Act here, and this is something which I find particularly interesting, is that the Indian Balancing Act is not really happening in South Asia. It's happening in Southeast Asia, and there is where I would say South China Sea, India's relationship with Philippines, India's relationship with Taiwan, which have been considerably improved over the previous months and the past year, and India's strategic partnership with Australia, Japan, and US, becomes important. So what one is really seeing as a consequence of China's Himalayan strategy is that the strategic board, which is really emerging, is in fact merging South Asia and Southeast Asia together. And I would say any recalibration or deliberation on what should be done, this pattern should really be taken cognizance of in a very serious manner. And in fact, I would say that today, the Himalayan strategy and the Indo-Pacific strategy are converging in interesting ways. Now, I think, much of what we've been hearing and much of the strategic analysts do recognize this. But I think what most of the people are actually missing in this very dynamic board game is really the environmental narrative. And I think if we really reinterpret and see, this landscape primarily through the lens of ecology, a different configuration will emerge. And I would say that this configuration can have social, economic, and political ramifications, particularly for the Asian countries. And therefore, before coming into the social, the economic, and the political ramification, I would like to really highlight this first question which you asked me about the ecological aspect and why is it that, the ecological context becomes very, very important. And there are a few points, which I would like to put it in record here, because not many of these debates actually come up in the strategic discourses that people generally discuss. Now, the first thing I think which we need to keep in mind is that Himalayas are young mountains. They are primarily still growing. We know that Northeast India is a seismic zone. It's prone to earthquakes. It's prone to landslides. And infrastructure and dam building activities, therefore, will have consequences. So while connectivity projects are happening, but we also know what will happen in due course if there are disasters. They are not going to be just disasters. They are going to be cascading disasters, primarily because of the interference which it will have with the debris and the human settlements which live along the riverine area. The second ecological aspect, I think, about these Himalayan rivers, and again, it really goes back to the industrialization and dam building activities which are really going up in Tibet, is that, the Himalayan rivers actually carry a lot of sediments. And in fact, these sediments, I would say, have a direct bearing, on the delta in the Bay of Bengal, on the health of the delta in the Bay of Bengal. In fact, there is a scholar, William Scuttle, by the name of William Scuttle, and he said that, Bangladesh is nothing but flattened Himalayas. And I think this, again, is very, very critical because it really tells us about how the upper riparian interventions are, in fact, really impacting and connected to the lower riparian areas. And therefore, any intervention which happens, particularly on account of deforestation, mining, dam building, will have an impact on the Himalayan rivers. This is again very important. Again, from the ecological perspective, a missing discourse, particularly in the international climate diplomacy, is really the Hindu Kush Himalayan range. Now, during the Paris summit in 2015, and this I think is very important when we're really looking at whether India is revisiting its Tibet policy, but I think this, at least from the perspective of Indian strategic thinkers, this is important. During the Paris summit in 2015, the issue of the third pole, which is, of course, the Tibet, was raised because we know that most of the rivers really come from Tibet. And scientists, in fact, claim that a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise is too hot for the glaciers in the Himalayan region. Now, this is important, again, because if you really look at Tibet and Tibet's ecosystem and its ecology, there are a lot of glaciers which are really sitting there. These are also known as ticking time bombs. So, in a scenario where there are flash floods, how do we really adapt to these flash floods, I think is very, very important. And more so because, it has also been pointed out that a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise would be a 0.3 degree higher in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. So I think when we are really talking about a climate discourse, where is the Hindu Kush Himalayan region? Where is the Tibetan plateau? So I think, really looking at the Tibetan plateau primarily from an ecological lens, not only as a way of China-India diplomatic engagement, I think it becomes very, very important. Another important point, which I would like to, in fact, highlight here, and this is a point which is coming up in some recent reports, which have been pointing out that if you really look at Tibet's land use policies, going by that, one cannot really treat Tibet as an internal affair of China. Role played by Tibet, particularly in the global climate system, is being highlighted. It's being publicized. It has also been increasingly claimed that what really happens in the Tibetan plateau influences the climate and the atmospheric changes, not only in Asia, but also in Europe. So, the climate of Asia and the climate of Europe are interconnected. And I think this is an argument which has been increasingly emphasized. And I think India really needs to take this out in a very conscious manner. And of course, lastly, we all know about the dam race, which is happening in the lower stretches of the Brahmaputra, the Yarlung Sangpo, and in the upper stretches of Arunachal Pradesh. Now, these dams are in many ways being been tasked or been cast as renewable energy projects. But I would say, given the social and the cultural consequences, I think both the countries really need to go slow on them. So I would say that, with this ecological backdrop, there could be potential reconfigurations at the social, at the economic, and at the political level. Let me just talk about the economic configurations here. And I'm talking about the lower South Asian countries, riparian countries, and the Mekong countries, the lower riparian Mekong countries. We all know that the food system, the energy system, and the water system is really linked, interdependent on each other. And if you look at both South Asia and the Mekong countries, the agricultural sector is really the backbone of the economy and really contributes, to the economy to a great deal. Water scarcity can not only impact the region in terms of food security, food imports, but to my mind, it can also make the lower Mekong countries dependent on China, which can have, if you take a scenario like that, can have an impact on the supply chains, particularly in the lower Mekong countries, and the kind of leverage, which China can have in account of drought. Now, particularly speaking from the social lens, if you look at what's been really happening in the Mekong countries, it's facing, there's a lot of water diversion which is happening there. Water drought, there are cases of drought happening, and droughts here are giving rise to a distinct migration pattern, where migration pattern is also kind of being linked to human trafficking. So this is also an emerging factor which is primarily coming up, particularly when you look at the social aspects in the lower Mekong countries. And finally, I would say the political aspects also again need to be looked at in the long term, because given the political regimes, particularly in the Southeast Asian countries, there could be a high dependence on China. Particularly, I was really looking at the BRI patterns, the projects of the BRI, the project patterns of the BRI in the Southeast Asian countries, and they are primarily benefiting the elites. So I think, how in a few years, in the case of water scarcity, would political stability be impacted, and how the political regimes again can be leveraged and could really impact the potential political equations there. I think these are some of the aspects which really come out when you start really looking at the scenario primarily from an ecological lens, because then the whole discourse around connectivity, in fact, really gets intersected and interfed by the ecological factor, which I think is very, very important. And in that count, I think it's very important how we really think about basin river management, how we really think about the link, which the upper riparian interventions have on lower riparian interventions. And I guess it's here that Tibet becomes a very important aspect for India to look at beyond just the human rights and the religious freedom which is really going on in there. And India really needs to take up this issue of environmental degradation. So yeah, I'll stop there.
No, I think those were brilliant points, Medha. Thank you very much. I think your point at the beginning about how there is a, the politics in South Asia and Southeast Asia have come together, and there is hardly anything to distinguish. And the Himalayan narrative that is emerging from ecological point of view, from third pole, from Tibet's point of view, and particularly from the construction of dams that is happening. Those are the issues which should be discussed also at the level of Indo-Pacific powers. And I think we'll come back to you to discuss more about this. But again, going forward, what I would invite our participants here, if they have any questions, please pose your questions in the Q&A box so that our speakers can, see those questions clearly and answer those. Already there is a questions, and I think you could already see this questions is coming from Devashish Sharma. He is asking about, to what extent do you think India's neighbors in the Himalayan regions, particularly Nepal and Bhutan, play a role on maintaining the balance of power against China? And if that balance of power tips in favor of China, do you think India may be on the edge for the foreseeable future regarding the 22 kilometers wide chicken snake that connects mainland India to the northeastern states? I will pose these questions to General Singh maybe after some time. But generally, in this round, I would invite each one of you to comment about two specific questions. One, I think I'll again start in the same order with Malcolm, with Ernest, then going to Mandeep, and then Satosan and Medha. My first question is that, we I mean, the world at large, particularly the military establishments from the West, let's say, for example, NATO, has clearly seen China as a future threat. Now, from that point of view, where does the scope for NATO to play a role in terms of sharing a complementarity, in terms of sharing informations, intelligence inputs with India, or vice versa? Do you think a NATO's collaborations with India, NATO's collaboration with Indo-Pacific powers pertaining to the politics in the Indo-Pacific is possible? That is number one. Number two, I think, what about broader political organizations like EU, European Union? Do you think India could possibly discuss it with the European Union about some of these issues, particularly as Medha and Sato-san was pointing out about infrastructural issues? EU has a global gateway strategy. Can we really talk about infrastructural collaborations? Can we really talk about climate issues? What Medha was rightly mentioning, that the Tibet issue, the environmental degradation in the Himalayan regions, is not only an issue that India or the South Asian countries should really be mindful. I think it's the whole world should be mindful about it. And so, given that background and given that context, do you think there is a scope and the role for European Union to play in the regions? If yes, how is it possible? What are the directives you will propose to have a collaborations that India could possibly have with NATO or with the European Union going forward? We'll start with you, Malcolm. Maybe 2 to 3 minutes each.
Okay, well, I mean, let me first state that I think that one of the trends that we are seeing is increasing sort of states working together on critical issues. AUKUS is a classic example of that, where Australia, US, UK are working together to not just acquire Australia, get nuclear submarines and work on critical emerging technologies, but to deter China. And I think you're seeing something similar at a political and diplomatic dimension with the Quad, with India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. You now have something called the Squad, which includes South Korea, Japan, Australia, and the US. So and the Philippines. So there's these not quite unilateral, but more than unilateral, but not multilateral arrangements that are starting to appear, which is very interesting. It's a new interesting dynamic in 21st century security relations, which I think is worth looking at. So in terms of India and NATO, I think there's ample grounds there for NATO to work with India in the same way that NATO is trying to become an Indo-Pacific power. There's a clear linkage there into India that we can explore where that leads. I don't see necessarily mutual security cooperation. I certainly, I'm not one of these people that believes in an Asian NATO. I don't think that's really a viable approach. But on specific issues, so in the same way that AUKUS is working on specific issues, you can do something similar between NATO and India, or develop the Quad into something more than a diplomatic arrangement. So it starts to deal with some harder security issues, such as what's happening on the line of actual control. And I think that's certainly one path where sort of India could start to work with other states and start to deal with some of the issues that it's facing in the Himalayas. I think, to be honest, the key impediment to this at the moment is India's relationship with Russia. India cannot really progress much very far so long as it maintains close relations with Moscow, given that the war in Ukraine is not likely to end anytime soon. And certainly it doesn't look likely that the Putin regime will be removed from power anytime soon. So I do think India needs to make some hard choices on its relationship with Russia. And it would be better advised to start thinking in terms of building that series of minilateral and multilateral relationships with Western liberal democracies in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe, because that's really where the future lies, not with Russia. And I think that if China is the key challenge, you look at China and Russia as their no limits partnership. That should speak volumes to India about sort of the wisdom of somehow keeping a relationship with Russia. So I'll probably stop there. I want to say the EU. EU is the other alternative, and I think that people in the past have dismissed the EU as a security actor. But I have to say, with the possibility of a second Trump administration and the uncertainty that creates for NATO, we would be, sensible to have a look at the EU as a fallback. If NATO's Article 5 were to be undermined by a second Trump administration, then the EU really needs to surge to the fore and basically become the principal security guarantor of Europe, in which case the EU then becomes the political entity of choice for India to engage with. I'll finish there.
No, I agree with you, and I think EU's mandate is expanding in Indo-Pacific region, so there is a possibility that the EU could collaborate with India on some of these issues. Over to you, Ernest. You have your thoughts for 2-3 minutes?
Well, first, I pretty much second everything Malcolm said for the most part. Going back to the Russia issue, though, it also, the invasion of Ukraine also creates a diversion for NATO to the point where you have to wonder how much resources and attention can it apply to the Indo-Pacific right now when it's faced with an existential threat on its very borders, which may be amplified by recent events with Ukraine invading into Russia, right? So what's Putin's response going to be? Is it going to draw NATO into the conflict? So that's something we have to be concerned about. And as Malcolm also mentioned, we can't really talk about being friends with Russia, but being adversaries with China. They're connected at the hip now, and if you curry favor with Moscow, you're basically strengthening Beijing in doing so. There is. I understand that your point about not everybody who's a friend has to be friends with everybody that that friend is with, but there are certain people that you have to have as a red flag to say, maybe this is a bridge too far, right? So I don't know that NATO at this point is going to make a substantial, difference in what India and other actors in the Indo-Pacific are able to do. I'm not that well versed in the EU to be able to speak to that. I would say that just as problematic as a new Trump administration might be in terms of NATO, having a Harris administration is also worrisome because there is a dearth of foreign policy experience in the leadership there. She has none, or her running mate has none. So hopefully they'll bring in somebody as Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense that has that kind of chops. But at this point, I don't have a whole lot of hope in that either. So it's kind of a toss up as to which one be more worried about coming to power, the devil that or the devil that doesn't know anything, that sort of thing. And as far as talking about the environmental issues and that Mehta brought up, it is of concern. But how far is the EU and the US willing to push that, given that China is the main source of batteries for all these electric vehicles that we're trying to pour into our economies now, right? We have mandates here in some of the states that we won't be selling internal combustion engines any longer after a certain date. That everything will have to go to electrical. And if China continues to hold the monopoly almost on some of the elements that go into creating those batteries and everything, they kind of have they kind of hamstring us in what we can do in terms of some of these initiatives that we're talking about that are aimed at the Indo-Pacific and the Himalayas in particular. We've got silly folks in the DoD that are even talking about electric tanks, for God's sake. Where the hell are you supposed to charge that in the Middle East or wherever the hell we have a tank, right? But these are obviously, it does speak to the need to bring the environment and ecological things into the equation, not just from diplomatic and economic perspectives, but also from the military perspective. So I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. General Singh?
Yeah, so very interesting. I have 5 straight points that I feel the EU, the West, and Japan could, perhaps assist or do towards what's happening in this part of the world, particularly of the LAC and India and China. The first and the foremost is, and I think it is, nothing can be direct. I mean, nobody is expecting a direct intervention. We can handle the LAC on our own. But what I'm going to suggest is indirect. And indirectly, the very first point is that there's a need to fragment Chinese power. So how do you fragment Chinese power? And I have this suggestion of what is called a binary split, which could be both horizontal and vertical. And so some of it was spoken about, that you have a binary split horizontally between what is building pressure on Taiwan, as also on the LAC, which stretches the PLA. But then there is also the vertical binary split, where while we have a confrontation on the land borders, it can also be stretched into the maritime domain in the Indian Ocean and in the Indo-Pacific. So all in all, I mean, if whatever can be done to fragment Chinese power will always assist everybody in handling or controlling the Chinese expansion. The second point I'd like to make is about the need for a no limits partnership. This was spoken about. Somebody just mentioned it. See, much as there is a no limits partnership between China and Russia, and you see what's happening now, they even set up factories in Tatarstan where they're now making 6,000 drones and giving them to Iran. I mean, this is amazing. There's a no limits partnership there. What stops a similar no limits partnership with India and the EU? And why can't we have a no limits partnership here too? Why are we only looking at that side? I mean, if the same happens and there are no limits, well, we need technology, we need support. I'm going to talk about it towards the end. The third point I'd like to make is about suggesting to the EU and to other nations in the West, please raise your defense budgets. You need to free US from providing an umbrella over Europe. And if that happens, please see the difference that it makes, so that all the focus can then shift towards China. Right now, the US is split between the Middle East, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. So a lot of difference will happen in case EU rises to the occasion by increasing the defense budgets. The fourth is maritime sea denial, right? One of the strongest ways in which the West and the nations, all naval powers, whether you see France, UK, Germany, Japan, they've got big navies. And in case the maritime space is denied to Chinese naval power, it will affect them economically, it will affect them militarily. And one is not saying that you restrict it to the Indo-Pacific. Why not to, for example, challenge them, say, along the African and the South American coast, in that areas? Why, for example, can't you have a maritime, an Asian NATO that has been spoken about in some places? This, I think, the getting together of like-minded nations in the maritime space will definitely offset a lot of the Chinese expansion. And lastly, I'd like to talk about exercises. See, the Indo-Pacific strategy, for some reason, seems to be focused towards the maritime domain only. And we in India find that the only nation involved in this and which has a land component in this dispute with China is India. And everyone else has maritime disputes. I mean, so what I suggest is that a greater number of exercises with the EU, with the West on our land borders will possibly assist in putting pressure. It will also assist in familiarizing these nations with the kind of problems that we have on our land borders. Just for the record, we have only 2 exercises with Japan, 3 with the French, 1 in each, that is Army, Navy, Air Force, 3 with UK, which is Army, Navy, Air Force, and only 4 with the US, out of which 2 are from the 2 are Air Force, 1 Army and 1 Navy. Now that must increase manifold, and most of it should now focus, a lot of it can focus on our land frontiers. So I thought I'll stop here. I think there are 5 suggestions that I think can be done indirectly. Thank you.
Those are outstanding points. Thank you very much. Sato-san and then Medha.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to speak after General Singh. He has provided a very comprehensive view about what can be done between NATO and NATO member countries and India. But I mostly agree with General Singh that the NATO as a whole and also NATO members individually, bilaterally dealing with India are slightly different issues in my view, because if you bring it to the level of NATO, then the UK is a member of NATO, and the generalized cooperation must be available to the British as well. And for that matter, I think India often finds bilaterally dealing with certain European countries is easier, especially in regard to France, for example. And I think India is comfortable with whatever the assistance India receives to improve the indigenous defense capability of Indian military forces, whether the partners are from Europe or from Japan or from US. I think that kind of assistance is very welcome, to the extent that the sheer presence of India in the kind of the peninsula location on the edge of the expanding, China, and having a good relationship with India is an interest of maritime powers of Europe, Japan, the United States. So they should cooperate with India without expecting much in exchange, like Donald Trump's transactional diplomacy or whatever you want to call it. I think there is a benefit in helping India, even if it's one way.
Thank you, Sato-san. Medha, over to you. There is a question in the Q&A box about energy issues in the regions. Would you like to address that? The question is, China seems committed to open, green and clean cooperation towards inclusive and sustainable developments with the BRI, incorporating many projects designated to promote clean and renewable energy. Do you think a project like that will be made or is already planned for these regions? And if there is a solution, do you think country like Nepal could put pressure on China? I would say that, I don't understand the full context of the question, but what I understand is that I think there is a lot of question about China's transparency issue over the BRI projects. And there is no transparency. This has been, widespread debate and acknowledged throughout the world, that when it comes to transparency, when it comes to environmental friendly projects, the Chinese definitely fall short. Now, can we really pressurize China to address some of these issues and build a coalition to address some of these issues? And how to build that coalition and what can be done between India and the West? Over to you.
Yeah. So Jagannath, like one of the things which I've really understood by looking at Chinese foreign policy is to really understand the narratives and the double meanings which are there in the narratives. They need to be unraveled, they need to be unpacked. So I think the best way to, in fact, really respond to Chinese is to first really understand the narratives, unravel the narratives, and create a counter narrative of sorts in terms of really trying to balance China in that context. So I think a counter narrative strategy is really needed in terms of responding to Chinese foreign policy on any of these issues, and so that's one, because there is a lot of double meaning. The way Chinese are also trying to project a particular thing, they align it with some of the international vocabularies, with some of the international standards, and much of it really goes unscathed. And this is particularly happening in the case of Tibet, when you really look down, when you actually zoom in to really look at what's happening. Many of these stories really come to the public domain, and that I think is very, very important for India to look at. The second thing, when we know that the Indo-Pacific and the Himalayan strategy are converging. We also know that there is a balancing act which is going on between China and India. I think one of the ways through which the balance can in fact really tilt towards India, and that I am very certain about, is really the ecological narrative. And for that, India will have to look at its own policies, for instance, with its neighbors in particular. Now, there's something I think I want to add here before I really go into the specifics, is that if you really look at India's own diplomacy with the neighborhood, I think this is a good, there is this good way, or this good space of really highlighting the ecological aspects and highlighting the more inclusive aspects which are needed in terms of bilateral cooperation with the neighbors. The second thing, I mean, if you really look at EU's own involvement in Asia, it's primarily around issues of sustainability and climate change. And I would say, rather than India being dictated by, say, an argument of NATO, or really trying to bring some of those strategic frameworks, to the Asian theater here, I think Tibet should be projected as a concern for global commons. And I think that is very important, because the carrying capacity of the Tibet, again, when you look at some of the narratives inside, is a big issue of concern. Its impact on global climate discourse really needs to be taken up seriously. And I think India can really take a lead, in this context. Even in platforms like the UNFCCC, I think questions of, supporting the Tibetan cause, primarily from an ecological perspective, becomes important. India has not really gone outright talking about human rights, etc. But I think because here the Tibetan Plateau impacts the Southeast Asian countries, the lower Mekong countries, and the South Asian countries, India should really take it forward, particularly when we are seeing that that India's policy towards Tibet is being, it's developing, and it could be on its path of being revisited to a certain extent, given that since 2008 or 2009, India has not really, reiterated one China policy in the public domain. So I think there is an opportunity here, and one should in fact take it forward with full arms. You on mute. Can't hear you.
No, thank you very much. I think those are interesting remarks, and I think I do agree with you. India needs to really relook at the Tibet issue, particularly from the ecological point of view. But with this note, let me go to the final round. This is a rapid fire round. We will end the discussion here. I will start with Medha and go in the reverse order, and end with Malcolm, because we started with Malcolm. So first to you, Medha, then Sato-san, then Mandeep, then Ernest, then Malcolm. Two specific issues. One, what is one problematic trend in the Himalayan region you will like to highlight and point out that the world should note about it? What the Chinese are doing in the Himalayan regions or in the Tibetan Plateau, that the world should really take a strong note about it and try to convince the smaller countries, the Himalayan countries in the regions. That is number one. Number two, what is the recommendation you will offer to the Himalayan community, particularly countries like Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh? Should they really look at some of the China's BRI projects? Should they try to reassess their relationship with China and should not really accept everything on face value, what would be that one recommendation to some of these Himalayan countries? So I'll start with you, Mameda.
So, I mean, as I said, I think when we are talking about Tibet, it's not really the water which is being diverted, it's the entire ecosystem. So it's the ecological degradation which is going on in Tibet, which needs to be taken up seriously, because water is not just water. Water is the entire ecosystem. It's your wetlands, it's your forests, it's your biodiversity, it's your sediments. I think that is very important when you're really talking about the Himalayan context. And the second thing, I think, this is time for India to recalibrate its own diplomacy, with the South Asian neighbors. And I think there is a light there. There is definitely, some bright spots there, given that what's really been happening in the BBIN region, with a lot of connectivity projects, inland waterways are really coming up, where in fact, Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh all look towards India in terms of connecting to Southeast Asia. So I think with that, and I think, if you really look at, there is where China's hand really comes in, and China is really trying to constrict India to a great extent. So I think it could be in India's own long-term interest if she really takes the ecological issue out front, and it's been really doing, at least domestically, when it really comes to water issues, India, there have been some progress. So I think with our neighbors, it's time to really look at our diplomacy with the BBIN countries, water diplomacy with the BBIN countries, and the treaties, which are very archaic, technical, managerial, need to be revisited. And I think one needs a holistic basin management perspective in that context. That will be good for India in the long term.
Excellent. Thank you. Sato-san?
Yes, yeah. I think for the countries between India and China, it's very important that they remain connected to both directions and try not to be dominated by China. So, the BRI offers into those countries, the neighboring countries are not going to reject those BRI offers as long as those offers are economically beneficial to those countries. And unlike, the port in Sri Lanka, the ownership questions of debt diplomacy and all that is not, I think, the same in the land infrastructure. So the land infrastructures can be more diverse, and there will be more alternatives. So in that sense, they will take the Chinese offers, and I think India needs to keep up with China playing this game of infrastructure assistance to South Asian neighboring countries such as Bhutan and Nepal. So, and I think it could be about the tourism traffic. It could be about the electricity supplies or water-related, resource issues. But the connectivity should stretch also to third parties like Bangladesh. I think Bangladesh is critical if you want to secure the northeastern territory of India. And without cooperation from Bangladesh, the sea access to those territory will be hampered. And this north-south kind of infrastructure assistance should be very well coordinated between, in not only India and Bangladesh, but also other aid countries into Bangladesh, like Japan. So the trilateral discussions for that matter will be very useful.
Excellent. General Singh?
Yeah, so rather than, I think my two policy recommendations, and I would more focus towards the West and the EU, and I have two suggestions. you see, let me be very candid in saying that we don't need your blood or we don't need your treasure. No, we don't. What we need is technology, 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 and unconditional technology. And that's why I alluded to the no limits partnership. If China and Russia, which have huge differences of their own, if they can have a no limits partnership, we need chips, we need aircraft engines, we need space-based offensive weapons. Should conditions like I'm hearing in this forum of India's relations with Russia as an impediment, if that is how it will continue to figure out, then I'm afraid it's not going to go anywhere. That the discussion is not going to see the light of day, right? So the first point is unconditional technology, and the second, which has been spoken about, is intelligence, full spectrum intelligence. And when I mean full spectrum intelligence, I mean space, operational, electronic, human, real time. Real time, not reactive intelligence, actionable intelligence. I think these two should help us, given would in many ways help us contest the Chinese expansion in this region. Insofar as you talked about, is there a question about Nepal, and are we going to address that later?
No, you might cover it in just 1 minute.
Yeah, so so as far as this, I am just talking about the Himalayan region and its effect on Nepal and Bhutan. I would like to answer this in a Chinese small story, which is always spoken about, the concept of Xi and Shashujian. And what does it say? It says that, it talks about that wall and the pondage, the dam wall and the pondage, and how the potential of the water, when it finds a weakness on the wall, it pushes through with the force, ultimately affecting everything that is on the other side of the dam. So I'm just trying to bring out that there is an Himalayan wall, and any incursion and break into this wall, whether it is in Nepal or it is in Ladakh or it's in Bhutan, when it forces through and it punctures through, it affects all of us on the other side, on the downside. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Excellent. Ernest?
Yeah, so I would go back to building upon what the general just spoke about. There's already a hole in the dam, and it's Pakistan occupied Kashmir, right? So the CPEC and all of that is already is working at least towards making that a permanent penetration, and the Chinese are just looking then to acquire more and more territory to build that infrastructure and to make that more problematic for India, but also more lucrative for China. And so my recommendation to Himalayan nations is, wake the heck up. The BRI is nonsense. It doesn't do what it's claimed to do. I'll use Sri Lanka as the example because that's where my wife's from. That's where I've spent the most time in South Asia. Yes, it built some nice highways, but what has it genuinely done for Sri Lanka? You have a highway that goes out to Hambantota, where you can drive and not see anybody for miles. You see elephants walking across the darn road and everything. It's a road to nowhere. And what has it done? It's bought politicians in Sri Lanka. And that's exactly what the BRI is aimed to do throughout the entire endeavor, is to buy the politicians. You look at Nepal, it's almost a puppet state anyway, because you have the Communist Party in charge there that is beholden to the Communist Party in China. Don't let that kind of same thing happen in Bhutan and elsewhere in the region. Maintain your sovereignty. Lean a little bit more on other folks, India, us, Japan, whoever, to fund those infrastructure projects. Don't fall for the siren song from China, because that's all it is, and it will lead to loss of sovereignty, and potentially turn you into the next Tibet. That's what I would say.
Spot on. Thank you. Very well taken, those points. Malcolm, will end with you, so you have a couple of minutes.
Okay. I would suggest that the region is facing two potential military developments or military revolutions, if you like. that are quite interesting and at opposite extremes. One is a very new one, which is intelligentization of warfare, role of artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, swarming, the return of mass on the battle space that could dramatically change the military equation and the military balance of power across the region. And I think that it's really important that we do not allow China to gain a decisive military advantage with these new technologies. So I echo General Singh here. I think that what needs to happen is for Western states to work with India to ensure that a relative balance of power in these new critical and emerging technologies, these new 21st century weapons and capabilities are maintained, because if you don't, then you basically cede the military initiative to Beijing, and they will be tempted to use that power aggressively to expand their reach. The second military dynamic, which I think is interesting, is an old revolution, which is the return of the salience of nuclear weapons. India, China, Pakistan, Russia, all nuclear weapon states. The region we're talking about in the Himalayas, sparsely populated, making it ideal environment for use of tactical nuclear weapons, particularly very low yield tactical nuclear weapons. It's very interesting to watch how Putin has been rattling his nuclear saber in Ukraine and intimidating and coercing NATO into restraining itself in terms of supporting Ukraine. And that has extended the war, it's cost lives, and it's made it left Ukraine in a difficult position to win, even with the ongoing Kursk gambit that's now underway. I think China will be watching that very closely. We'll be watching how the West responds to those Russian nuclear threats and learning lessons. And so what you could see as Russia expands its nuclear weapons capabilities in the coming years, it won't just be in strategic nuclear forces, it could be in tactical nuclear forces as well. In which case then India has to think about not just a tactical nuclear threat from Pakistan, but then a tactical nuclear threat from China. So I think that there needs to be some sort of dialogue or process whereby we dissuade China from going down that path. We find some way to turn off that drift towards a very dangerous and unstable tripolar nuclear arms race in the Himalayas at the tactical nuclear weapons level, not strategic but tactical, maybe the intent on the part of Beijing to think that they can actually get away with using these things in terms of very low yield weapons that are, might be 5 kilotons or a kiloton, but it's still a tactical nuclear weapon. So that would be my 2 suggestions.
Brilliant. I think those were useful comments, Malcolm. Thank you very much. With this note, let me thank all of you for joining today. I think it was a very fruitful last couple of hours. We have been immensely benefited in this project, China's Himalayan Hustle. In fact, we are going to prepare a report and publish it in the website on the basis of your remarks. And also we are going to put the audio and video recording in our website. So you could possibly see it sometimes next week or next to next week. In the process, I will also encourage our participants, those who have joined from different parts. Thank you very much for joining. Please follow ISDP's writings, publications closely. And some of our panelist writings who are writing for our website, they are a part of our fellow networks. We'll be engaging with them more in our future events. So stay in touch. And also with this note, let me thank all of you, all the panelists and participants who have joined on the behalf of our director, Dr. Nicholas Winston, to thank all of you. He has conveyed his hello and regards to you, and we'll stay in touch for our future events. With this note, let me also thank my ISDP colleagues who are on the back of in this event, who are helping us to have this webinar, particularly my 3 colleagues, Lena Fragier, then Anna Jarmuth and Anna Isis. They have been extremely cooperative in terms of holding not only this webinar, but also earlier 3 rounds of webinars. We are going to publish all the reports and share with you. Thank you very much and have a lovely evening. And we are really grateful to Malcolm and Sato-san for joining at almost at the midnight. Have a good evening in India also. This is almost nearing deep night. So have a good evening, good night, and take care, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you very much.